The United Front, written by the R guy. There was a joke told across consortium-controlled space. Ask 3 Terrans for their opinion on a basic question, and you'll get 6 answers and 3 separate arguments. I'm not one to say that is true or not. I've only had to deal with Terrans briefly in my time, and it was always in a diplomatic sense. However, that is not to say that the joke doesn't hold any water in reality. It is a widely known fact across the galaxy that humans, as they call themselves, are a divided species. It is rare for those few with the cognition and will to break the bonds of their cradle and venture out into the stars to be so divided when they do so. The resources undertaking such an endeavor typically entail that only a species united can break the chains of gravity and explore the weightlessness of the abyss. The Terrans are different, though. As they fought their way into space, developing the necessary technology as a byproduct of their need to kill one another, they fought with each other, even as they ventured to other planets, gaining access to resources and riches thought unimaginable. They killed, rebelled, murdered, and revolted their way into the stars, choosing not to fight against the harshness of the cosmos as a collective, but as a byproduct of fighting each other. Factions formed empires that rose and quashed opposition and neighbors alike before fracturing into pieces. The Tuggantari adventurer, a species that believes in the magic of the afterlife and souls, once told me, before the war had started, when I was a young hatchling, that Terran-occupied space was the most haunted place in the galaxy he'd ever been to. He told me that all who attuned to the veil of death felt its whispers and cries as soon as they crossed into human lands of the forever war, and that screams became louder the closer he got to Terra herself. Eventually, the Consortium, a collective of 1,325 species, made contact with the Terrans in a 48 light-year cube of space. It was a small territory, navigable by a 1-month FTL voyage from end to end, a short time in the vastness of the abyss where it took 42 years to get to Terra from the Consortium capital. First contact with the Terrans came from a group that called themselves the United Republic of Socialist Systems. At the time, the diplomats believed this to be the extent of the new species, because, up until then, almost all connected species were fully united. Less than a year later, the space occupied by the Opelian Corporation was discovered, and the rest of the pieces fell into place shortly after. It was disgusting to those early diplomats to hear how flippantly the Terrans, from all 5 of their major factions, discussed the murder of another member of their species. The most unimaginable of sins, the vilest of actions, was talked about in the same manner as a gunksy hunter might discuss a big game kill. The vitriol with which the Terrans spoke of one another was so fraught with insult and slur that it was hard to imagine the speaker being of the same blood as his target. Immediately, plans were drawn. Terrans were dangerous. They were pathogens that needed to be eliminated before they spread throughout the galaxy. Many tried to look back on the speeches given by the politicians and pretend that it wasn't something that they would have fallen for, that they would have bravely stood up and defended the Terrans. But they wouldn't have. They wouldn't have, because those politicians, no matter how vile or hate-filled their rants may have been, were right in their core message. The Terrans could not be allowed to interact with the Consortium's people. Any Terran would tell you themselves that they were not fit for the Consortium's rules and order. The bureaucracy and tectonic dullness would see them resort to war sooner to solve differences. I know this because it is my job to know this. I'm a negotiator, after all, one of the greatest the Consortium ever produced. I'm needed because the Consortium regularly fails to stop war from breaking out between its member species. And that's where I've been brought in to mitigate and disperse them before anything could get out of control and immense amounts of lives are lost. Because of this, in my youth, I was brought out to help sign numerous Terran peace treaties, assisting the 2 parties in signing. 90% of treaties were broken by the time I got back to my home planet Yath, which is a mere 17-year cryovac journey from Terra. So, let me get to the part of the story that you've been waiting for. The part that launched my install claim to fame through my prediction that was never going to work. The Terran Consortium War. The plans were startlingly simple. Puppeteer the Terrans into killing each other. It was so simple that only a few saboteurs were needed to destroy critical infrastructure and have the Terrans immediately blame their enemies. After the dust settled and the factions decimated, the full might of the Consortium would sink into the Terran space and destroy any power base of the factions that remained. The only problem was that the saboteurs were caught. It was the Republic of Solar, the closest of the factions to the Consortium's bureaucracy, who discovered the plot. The agents were caught on a slave hauler that had been intercepted in their territories. Soon, their knowledge of the attack spread to the other factions within the Terran space, and by the end of the week, almost all the Consortium's infiltrators had been caught. I knew that it would happen because the Terrans' constant fighting demanded that their intelligence network would be powerful enough to counter any infiltration. They were paranoid of attack, constantly expecting one, so they were never going to ignore multiple Consortium species wandering around their territories unmonitored. It was, however, a surprise to me what came next. The infiltrators were publicly executed on live broadcasts across the galaxy, as the Terrans, speaking in their native tongues, declared all internal conflicts paused in the face of the threat the Consortium faced. That all factions, from the ever-at-war ones like the URSS and the Apollyon Corporation, to the isolationist ones like the nativists, who ruled Terra herself with bloodied iron fists, the religious extremists of the Holy Caliphate of Abraham, and the Solarians themselves, united under the symbol of the blue bauble to go to war with the galaxy itself. The Consortium laughed. I didn't. My colleagues who had worked with the Terrans didn't. Neither did those who had read Terran history laugh. The Consortium laughed because how could a single species, no matter how great, defeat the collective might of thousands? How could a people occupying such a small parcel of barren space think themselves capable of matching the might of the Consortium's resources and capital? How could 1,800 stars match the might of trillions? It was simple. Really, really simple. The Terrans didn't care if a star system couldn't support life or a colony for mining. They didn't care if they sucked a system dry, leaving it only a barren husk in the middle of dead space. But most species had the technology to kill stars through devouring their energies. Only the Terrans were insane enough to build such power plants. The Consortium occupied an incalculable number of stars, yet they only used a couple of tens of millions. And even then, 97% of those had only a single mining base to their name. The Terrans, meanwhile, used every star, planet, brown dwarf, asteroid, and other object they could find. So, while the Consortium laughed, those who knew Terrans, or the way they thought, knew the real meaning of the declaration: total war. And so the Consortium laughed as it moved its army into place. The generals were not at their best, nor were the troops or ships. It was the glory seekers and idiots who threw themselves into the command posts, thinking that no faction would answer the Solarians' call, and they would be able to flex the might of the galaxy. They were shocked when the factions answered the call to war. While each leader gave separate reasons for their decision in order to appease their people, it didn't matter the faction or who they were at war with at that moment, because all answered the call. Apollyon spoke of bottom lines and business. The URSS gave speeches on the continuing revolution of Marx into the new age. The nativists spoke of the sanctity of Terra and her people, stressing that the bugs must not be allowed to sully her sacred soils. The Abrahamic preachers spoke of demons from beyond the void and the need for a crusade and jihad. Finally, the Solarians spoke of attacks on democracy and the need for revenge. All answered the call. All raised their arms against the threat of the Consortium's armies. The Consortium weren't idiots, though. They didn't charge drunkenly into Terran lines with a rust bucket fleet that was meant to take only one faction. They still believed themselves invincible. They still laughed, and they just upped their size of the invading army. No one expected the Terrans to attack first. However, when the first Samari systems, the species that bordered the most Terran space, started to go silent, followed by the screams for backup and reinforcements, belief didn't matter. Bloody was one word to describe the attacks. Slaughter was another. The Consortium's tech far outweighed the projectile shooters the Terrans had equipped themselves with. However, no matter the number of Terrans killed, more came until the blaster ran low on fuel and power. All their barrels melted due to overuse, and the soldiers were overwhelmed. The stories of Terran soldiers picking up the rifles of the dead to shoot at the Consortium spread like wildfire. A boogeyman was born, a hunter of fitful dreams. However, after the initial surprise wore off, the consortium started to push back. The hordes of Terrans waned, and their armies fell back as the tide of the front line reversed. Worlds were recaptured, but they were shattered by the Terrans exploiting as much as they could out of the piece of rock and gas as they left. Hundreds of systems burnt to a crisp, their stars weakened, their gas giants sucked dry, and their rocky worlds pocked with holes. This is where the slur for Terrans, Ganzon, the Samari word for world eater, came from. The consortium's leaders likened them to parasites or infections, something that only takes and consumes. Finally, though the consortium reached Terran space, the first systems fell easily. Still, there was nothing to collect from them, as the humans seemed to burn the very fabric of space in their retreat, frying shields and melting engines of the consortium ships as they passed through. I'm not an expert in military strategy, so it wasn't I who first said that the Terran's retreat was purposeful, a trap. However, it was a sentiment I no less agreed on. The Terrans knew how to lie, even on the battlefield. The consortium invaded Terran space on 3 sides and, as a result, had only their own bodies to return to. Terran system after Terran system fell along their borders, most without a fight, but some made the consortium pay with blood of millions. Then they hit the fortress systems. The Terrans had been in a constant state of war since they had first left their ancestral tree dwellings. I once had a diplomat tell me that there was never a part of Terran space that didn't have a conflict going on, that even unholy Terra herself, man still fought man for petty squabbles eons old. In their state of war, they had designated certain areas to serve as a front line against any invasion. Most of these were intended to protect them from other human factions. However, they were now being used by the united humanity to hold the line against the consortium's might. The full economic output of all 5 of the great factions focused on holding no more than 20 star systems. The consortium's over 1,000 species fighting for scraps of rock and metal light years from their home planets. The Terrans fighting like cornered animals, sacrificing themselves if it meant killing only a dozen consortium. The system-sized forges of Apollyon Corporation, which were powered by the very breath of the stars themselves and manned by over 1 trillion slaves building weapons of war around the clock until they collapsed. The endless horde of soldiers being drafted by the URSS, sent to throw themselves against the sword of the consortium's invasion until it was blunted. The artisans of the solar churning out endless propaganda to continue the fervor, while the scientists worked on new weapons of war with the nativists, neither party caring about the scruples of ethics. Finally, the Holy Caliphate of Abraham, sending out their Knights of Isaiah, super soldiers trained to kill hundreds of consortium before dying by the billions. All of Terra's offspring are fighting for those fortress systems. Mausengrad, Praxis, Circe Prime, Milford Hydrogen 3 Production Plant 17. Systems that saw billions of dead, millions of ships in ruins, and entire planets destroyed. The consortium bloodied itself against these systems, sent billions to die, as each system saw millions of dead mounting up by the day. It was no wonder that eventually one side had to break. And it wasn't the Terrans who fought with the same suicidal fervor as they did when the systems were first reached. Mausengrad broke first, and after the consortium retreated, stumbling over the top of the very bodies that they had to climb to reach their positions, the rest soon followed. The supply line had been thrown into disarray when the humans purposely detonated 2 stars close to the old human border with the consortium. Encirclements were rampant. Fleets would go to rendezvous points, only to be met with a wall of Terran guns. The Terrans surged forward, and the consortium had been pushed back to the border. The consortium had been beaten. The largest collective of species in the galaxy had been beaten and had its army decimated in the process. The Terrans, under the united flag of the Terran being circled by her daughter Moon, had pushed the consortium back. That was where I was brought in to help with the peace negotiations. I was young, considering that my kind lived to 700, but I was not inexperienced, having lived 130 years, 70 of them as a negotiator. The human delegation was massive, comprising of all 5 factions, each seeking its own concessions for the losses it sustained in the fighting. It was an arduous process that took nearly half a decade of my time to negotiate, and probably 4 times that off my lifespan. But in the end, I did it, and I was seen as the one who brought peace. After the ceremony where the humans shook hands with their counterparts, I managed to pin down one of the leader delegates from the URSS and ask him a simple question that I'd been meaning to ask since the conflict started almost 3 decades earlier. Why and how did the Terrans unite so quickly? His answer was simple. When you have enemies, you must always portray a united front. No faction in Terran space is truly whole. Every single one is fighting some skirmish with rebels within themselves. But they know that when it comes to their enemies, they must be united. When the consortium made their intentions clear, it was a simple matter of declaring yourself to the cause. The man said his galactic standard accent was rough and unpolished. But what of your ideology and conflicts before the war? I'd asked in return, and the man smiled. It wasn't the first time in human history that warring states have united themselves to fight against a greater enemy. I doubt it'll be the last, he answered before leaving with his delegation. It is the curse of being part of the galaxy's longest-lived species to see things forgotten as people who experience them die and the status quo returns. However, that man's words never left my mind, even with it having been centuries since he drew his last breath. The horrors of war the consortium fought and the price the parents were willing to pay never left me either. Even after the Terrans started fighting each other almost as soon as they got back to their systems, even now, old and confined by the limitations of my body, I think of those diplomats' words as the mistakes of the past begin to repeat in the present. Savages, brutes, vermin, a cleanse is needed to save the galaxy. That's what the politicians say nowadays when they talk of the Terrans. They'll be too busy fighting themselves. All we need to do is not let our plot reveal itself this time. Our father fought the war wrong. With hindsight, we will defeat the scourge. It is hubris in its finest form. I know, having seen the script before, that once kicked, the splintered hive and blood and war the Terrans call home will unite into a wall of steel and guns, impenetrable to outsiders. Once kicked, the Terrans will always form a united front that can face off even against the whole galaxy. I just hope that I don't live to see history repeat. End of story. I'd greatly like to thank our Tier 5 channel members, Casper Arnholt, John Creighton, Manatharia, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.